Welcome to the Potboiler. I'm Patrick Hughes, and this is The Hero Business, Part 7. Potboiler is an old term for pulpy paperback genre writing that I think needs its time to shine. So let's do the intro. Eric has spent a life not being injured and not aware he's being hurt. He didn't have the awareness to understand that the pain he'd endured could have an effect on the people that care for him. As he shares more of his story with Molly, he has to contend with the hurt she feels for him. And as Todd discovers that the motel fire was likely arson, Eric is also forced to confront that his actions draw attention, and attention brings consequences. And he's seeing those consequences build. The episodes of this story will be offered with no embedded commercial interruption. Visit patrickhughes.ca for links to me and to my other projects. And please stick around after the story for some very light business. The Hero Business features excerpts from my novel, The Valiant Unheroic, which is available for order on my website. Eric Verrity rocks. The Hero Business, Part 7. Eric, when did you know you could do these special things? Molly had labored over how to raise this topic. She was fueled by both a relentless and selfish curiosity and a desire to perform the kind of amateur therapy only people who really care can attempt. When did you really know? It took him a second to decide how to tell the story. He hadn't thought about it consciously in years, though it resonated through his brain in bits on a daily basis. A few months had passed since Todd's frustrated explosion has caused the large picture frame to crash down over him. Todd had managed in that time to erase Eric from his world. Todd existed in that house without the slightest hint that would acknowledge Eric's presence. It had also been some time since the incident he and Mrs. Danver shared at the kitchen sink. They had managed, in a superficial way, to almost put it completely behind them. In that time, the truth of how he was different started to set in upon him. Thus far, he'd always been able to bury the experience the way most people did with things they couldn't understand. They were growing in his mind, ringing true somehow with something that sat behind a curtain inside him, forcing him to confront this quality of his. He couldn't be sustained just hoping it would go away, remaining content with the emptiness of observing. Being an outsider was something he had thus far experienced outside of himself. You can only ignore these things for so long. He knew he'd soon talk to Dr. Harmon about it. They had a session scheduled for later that afternoon. But his brain refused to unburden him. He could see the way people were divided, the way classes and levels of acceptance had formed through his adolescence. He was aware of the superficial contrast between him and those of Todd's social strata. Clothes and looks and talents separated those kids with intangible dungeon walls. Erecting itself on top of these walls were differences that Eric now saw in himself, differences that would be incomprehensible to those who condemn others for transgressions involving designer jeans and colors that don't match. He couldn't conform the way they needed him to and subscribe to their ambition. He could see now that there was more to him than his own isolation, than just simple conformity. Todd's voice, screaming "freak," rocked in his ears like a dull pickaxe cracking inside his cranium. He had to put this relentless quality in a direction to see where it would go. Miss Danver hummed gleefully as she scuttled about in the kitchen, and the fire perpetually sparked and flickered beneath him in the fireplace. Mr. Danver used to start a fire every Friday before dinner. Since their separation, Mrs. Danver had taken to keeping up the tradition. The things that made him different, the things that made other people the same. Sameness and distinction filled his head and overtook his control like boiling water that bubbles out from the lid of the pot. He looked around the room that he'd always managed to feel so comfortable in. Turned to the television set and the knickknacks that sat in the cabinet to his right. Among them was a tiny porcelain cow that he always found himself staring at. Its little face had small painted dots for eyes that he would stare into and swear they were looking back. The cow had no particular distinction to speak of. He'd never heard mention of it by Mrs. Danver in an anecdote that explained its origin. He'd never seen anyone in the house actually look at it or acknowledge it. He suddenly found the reason the cow and he had always stared at one another. For a desperate moment, Eric considered that all they had in the world was one another. This little porcelain souvenir that probably would have never been missed if it ever were noticed was a part of the fabric of that house. Eric felt normal because he felt the presence of the little porcelain friend and he felt the house around him. If that cow weren't there, somehow it all would crumble. For every moment he felt normal in that house, another followed where he felt alone in space. He felt like he was floating through blackness and no one was there to pull him in. He turned from the cow and looked into the fireplace. Objects and images take on personalities when you're young. For some reason, in all those moments when Eric sat in that room feeling banished in distinction, he seemed to look over at that fireplace and never felt warm. Most of the time it was inactive. It was a big black hole at the end of the room that sat there menacingly. On Fridays it was always burning. For some reason, when it was burning, Eric felt worse. There's something Eric didn't like about fire. He'd always watch people react to it and not quite understand their attraction. They would play with it by getting in close and hum a sound of pleasure before turning away when it got too hot. Or they would feel the need to taunt and test it by waving a hand across its crown. Around a fire, they would stare into its dancing light with a captivation Eric had never once understood. When the fireplace burned, it seemed to laugh at him. Just after realizing the significance of the cow, he realized the significance of the fire burning that Friday afternoon. Fire was one of those things that made him feel different. It was one of the things he couldn't share with Todd and kept him looking in as he floated through space. He would never be lured in close to the heat and turn away when it got too hot, or stare into it with the wonder of a friend and enemy. Fire couldn't hurt him. It It didn't warm him. It only seemed to dance and chuckle. He was then kneeling down in front of the fire, leaning in close to try and feel the radiant heat that seems to overcome everyone else. He stared like a laser into the flickering sparks of light, waiting to be hypnotized. But the charm of the flames never befell him. He moved the screen aside to put his hand in close. He began waving his fingers across the top of the flames like he'd seen Todd do with the candles on the dining room table. He watched the little licks of smoke curl around his fingers as the moisture on his skin evaporated, like they were blown from the lips of the fire that kissed him. He felt the warm air rushing up around his hand, thrust upward by the fire. He could sense the warmth of the fire itself, tickling at him, but never causing the urge to retract. He knew how fire could burn. He'd seen how fire bites the hand if it's there too long. He knew it could rip at the skin and scar and kill. He pictured those moments of pain in his mind, when the hand recoils, is pulled in close and protected against the chest, how it shakes the person, feeling it looks as though they'd trade all the riches in the world they ever had wished for to let the pain cease. He'd have then traded all he ever wished for to have that pain. Within those thoughts, he searched for that sensation. His hand was now held still. The fire poured around it like it was hungry for flesh. He stared at his hand in the flames, trying to will it to blacken in the fire. And he closed his eyes, hoping that the blessing of pain would find him. Pain could hopefully find him and make him normal. Eric had very little use so far in his life for the notion of hope. Hope is something that tends to enter the minds of those taught to desire things through an instinct to be accepted and to conform. Eric had never had that instinct. He had never been hungry or cold or the subject of praise, and only recently learned the value of acceptance. With this new knowledge came the idea of hope. He found himself hoping that something would change, that by the grace of something, the fire would penetrate his skin, show him he had blood and bone and soul beneath, welcome him toward acceptance. There's something comforting about that feeling, even though the pain never came. "Eric! My God, what are you doing?" Dr. Herman and his charged exclamation burst Eric from his almost meditative state. Before he could react, the doctor had bounded across the room and pulled his arm from the flames. A surge of guilt then burned through him as he watched his friend's anxious eyes examine his soot-covered arm. Eric looked as though he'd been caught in a lie. At first glance, his forearm appeared far graver than it actually was. Eric's sweater had burned and frayed, clinging to his arm, causing an awful odor in the room. A combination of carbon and burnt fabric gave the illusion of an injury, but after a moment of examination, it was clear to Julius that Eric had not been burned in the slightest. The guilt of that replaced the pain Eric desired, multiplied as he saw realization grow in Harmon's eyes. He knew he had just exposed his only friend to the truth that had once chased away his brother. The guilt he was feeling for Julius was The same he felt for Todd, as though he'd taken something from them and introducing something that couldn't be real. He could hardly look into the eyes that now looked deep into his, that had been the safest place he'd ever known. There was a way that Julius wasn't surprised by what he saw. It was in a tiny little way, like when one encounters unspeakably dreadful news and somehow sensed it coming. He had heard the story of the ravine accident, briefly from Todd, Mrs. Danburn, and some detail from Eric, but it just didn't process until that moment. A part of him hoped it was embellished, as everything they'd discussed since seemed to be, and the truth of Eric's distance needed to be faced. He knew now the thought was irresponsible. He knew because of what this kid was apparently capable of doing to shorten that distance. He was stunned on every level. His every muscle was clenched and immobile. His brain raced through everything his entire career had brought him and everything he knew about Eric, but his mouth wouldn't move. He knew enough about this young charge to see the empathy rushing through him was replacing the agony of scarring burns. They were both aware of the weight of this moment and suffered as it crushed them. "I'm sorry, Dr. Harmon." Eric's eyes dropped as he lowered his head. Without knowing it, Eric had broken the tension of solid steel in the room. Julius allowed the smoldering air around them to re-enter his lungs. His balance left him in his crouch, and he fell back to a sitting position. He smiled and shook his head, certain that there was no book or theory in existence for the path he was about to tread. "You haven't done anything wrong, kid, aside from making your sweater into a short sleeve." He took another deep breath. "I guess we've got ourselves a lot to talk about." Molly's hand covered her mouth in her overflowing sympathy, despite Eric's emotionally detached account. He might have stopped telling the story had he known he was affecting her in such a way. She deserved to have her question answered. "I've never been afraid of getting hurt. It might be some kind of instinct." He turned back from the distant image through the window. Seeing Molly's eyes swelling with tears stammered him slightly. "I always looked at people and felt different from them. Watching over people has always felt right." "I can't imagine what it must have been like for you, Eric." "I don't want you to feel bad for me." "What do you mean?" "That's what I'm supposed to do." "There's no reason I can live with that would make you feel the way you're feeling and looking at me now." Molly rose from her chair. Her eyes stayed low and bashful, pulling her towards him. "Everybody has to deal with being different, Molly. Dr. Harmon used to tell me that's the way we deal with being different that makes us..." "Be quiet, Eric." He'd never said enough in one breath to be told to stop. She spoke softly. Her hands were now in his. hanging down by their sides. Their bodies were touching at various points. She nuzzled her nose into his neck below his jaw and slowly ran her cheek along his face to his mouth. They could feel the wave of tiny follicles and goosebumps right before contact occurs, when the microscopic stretch of space between two people is energized. He didn't speak. He couldn't have. He could hear her fast, deep breaths. She was only marginally more prepared for the energy growing around them. His body was soft and still as Molly continued to close the space between them. He tried shutting his eyes as she did, but kept opening them to look desperately into the distance. He didn't know how to distinguish excitement and wonder from tension and something like fear. He could feel her lips, then softly glazed with moisture, slowly press into his cheek just under his eye. It was the strongest form of contact his impervious structure had ever encountered. It had the power to injure him. His eyes intensified as she brought her face back in line with his. One of her hands left his and crawled up his body. Her fingers probed across his neck and up behind his ear. In through his hair, her palm rested against the top of his neck. Slightest pressure guided his head forward, his lips down to hers. Her kiss weaved and swam through his. Her almost inaudible humming and moaning and breathing were all he could hear. He could still feel the energy that stirred in the cracks left between them. It radiated from the center and reached out to his extremities. Eric had rarely noticed beautiful things before. He'd always perceived things the way he was told to perceive them. A chair was for sitting, and a picture was merely a photograph. The sunset was just the sun retiring until morning. Eric didn't know until the second of his embrace that something of beauty could inhabit your mind in a way that just merely never could. Beauty suddenly held him the way he seldom was held. She was the first beautiful thing he'd ever seen. The third second passed as Eric's conscious thought returned. A mild wave of panic replaced the warmth as he tried to predict the uncharted waters. Just then the cat trotted onto the windowsill and meowed sharply enough to stun the moment. Their lips slowly separated. They were afraid of each other's eyes. A new smile that Eric then saw eased that fear. It was an expression he'd never seen her carry that was made of the fear they both felt. The smile immersed him into the comfort he deserved. Molly looked up and saw Eric smiling too. Chapter 21. Eric Verrity was becoming a fussy host. He'd taken to worrying about the nuances of his modest apartment when his guests, namely Molly and Todd, were scheduled to visit. It was nearly 9 o'clock, and he'd just finished ensuring that his couch was lined up parallel to his coffee table and the chair was exactly perpendicular and in line. No clutter was to be found. Everything was wiped, swept and dusted. Todd was due any minute. He'd called the previous night, asking if Eric would have some free time in the morning to discuss the findings of the motel fire investigation. A few minutes past 9, he tapped the door and entered casually. Threw his overcoat over the easy chair and found a place on the couch with plenty of space on the coffee table in front of him. There were some interesting findings by the fire marshal's office that I'd like to discuss with you, Eric. Todd's opening tone was almost overly official. He caught himself and tried to scale it back. This case goes to the police department tomorrow, so if I don't break anything, I want to make sure that your part in this is taken care of so their investigations stay off your back. Todd chuckled and slapped him on the knee. I'm looking out for you, pal. What's wrong? Eric could tell the business of the fire was quite unfinished. Todd produced a file folder and spread its contents out over the coffee table. There was evidence of tampering on the gas line and residue left from explosives behind the motel. Someone deliberately caused that explosion, Eric. Eric's face turned away as he tried to comprehend what Todd was telling him. The notion that someone would intentionally cause that destruction took a second to sink in. Why would someone, the technical expert from the fire marshal, describe the sabotage as amateur, so maybe the perpetrator was acting quickly or impulsively, triggered by passion or psychosis. I'm convinced the owner, Mrs. Pinsky, is not involved in some scam. Not when she was sleeping so close to the blast. Eric watched Todd switch in and out of his role as investigator, like he was watching himself and keeping himself in check. It's possible that the motel falls on the border of rival gang territory. They're usually eager to take credit for these things. He dropped his pen and looked up from the report file. There is one other possibility I've been considering. Todd wanted to be sure to get his delivery right. This fire could be more directly involved with you. What do you mean? Eric's tone would have almost been defensive if he thought he had reason to be. This happened right in your neighborhood, right on the route you always walk, at the time you always walk it. It happened late on a Tuesday night when all the adulterers had long gone home and when occupancy was low. The owner's a quiet old lady who'll happily retire with the insurance money and not stir up a big fuss. Todd had never before said anything that Eric had more trouble believing. I think it's just possible. Look, if I wanted to get you involved in a situation like this is how I would do it. But why? I don't know why. I can't be sure about any of this yet. But I'm supposed to follow my hunches. You're the most unbelievable person I've ever met, Eric. I think that anything concerning you will have to consider the unbelievable. Silence fell as Eric's eyes turned puzzled. If it means anything, I meant that as a compliment. Well, thank you. Okay, think hard. Was there anything about that whole evening that seemed suspicious or wrong? Out of place? Could be a person, a parked car, something left behind. Can you think of anything? It was still a flood of images to Eric. His memory was sharp and crisp. He could break the images down to second-by-second snapshots. But in the case of that evening, everything was so vivid. The snapshots themselves were overwhelming. Everything erupted around him in his memory. It was hard to distinguish or classify the stress, the screams, and the fire. Wait. That kid. The brief encounter with the frightened teenager he collided with on the street had been buried in his mind beneath the explosion that happened moments later. He suddenly remembered the urge he had to pursue him as he darted away into a nearby alley. There was a strange fear in that kid's eyes. You mean the kid you mentioned before? Yes, there was a kid I bumped into down the street from the motel. It was just before the fire started. That he must have started running. He ran into me and fell. Before I could apologize, he ran off. There was something in the way he looked up at me. He gave me that feeling I get. A shiver. Right when something bad happens. Todd's eyes and head perked up. Well, something bad happened, all right. You didn't mention your feeling the last time. Tell me more about this kid. Had you seen him before? Do you know who he is? No, I've never seen him around the neighborhood. Eric's eyes jumped away from Todd again, across the room to the closet. The phone. The phone? The jacket Eric had worn that night was singed badly from the fire and saturated with smoke. He'd planned to throw it away, but it hung neglected in the back of his coat closet, having already been replaced by a brown woolen replica. He completely forgot about it, along with the cell phone that still sat in its pocket. Eric rushed over to the closet with Todd enthusiastically on his tail. Eric presented it to Todd, who looked over it like a prize. He produced a clear plastic baggie and dropped the phone into it as he walked slowly back to the couch, with his eyes locked on the little device. His fingers maneuvered through the buttons, scrolling through the phone's tiny screen. There's no names or numbers listed in the directory. This struck Todd immediately. Every self-reflecting cell phone user usually makes use of a few of the handy administrative options. Even if they don't, in most cases, phones are programmed to keep the bank of recently dialed numbers. This phone, which still looked brand new, admittedly on the cheap burner phone side of things, had no record of incoming or outgoing calls. This spoke volumes to Todd. Either this apparently troubled young kid who raised Eric's gifted attention had just purchased a cell phone for personal reasons, had neglected to set any phone numbers, and was coincidentally running from a crime scene moments before the crime for an unrelated reason, or this phone was purchased for a purpose and was set deliberately to be untraceable. If the latter was indeed the case, Someone was orchestrating this act from behind the scenes. Todd suddenly had a possible conspiracy and a starting point. After promising to keep Eric updated on the findings from the cell phone, Todd hurriedly gathered his things and threw on his overcoat. He was on his own cell phone and out the door before Eric could think to say goodbye. Eric, I'm so happy you're on time. There are so many things we have to discuss. His previous greetings were always more subdued and cordial, planned and practiced. His kinetic energy seemed to increase with every meeting. Maynard's receptionist, Sophie, had never before seen her employer pace about the reception area in anticipation of a patient's arrival. Many things about the sessions with Maynard had changed in recent weeks. Though Maynard's growing enthusiasm was moderately infectious, his uncharacteristic behavior puzzled those around him. Eric enjoyed the excitement exuding from Benjamin, but was beginning to notice the cost of his new direction. Won't you come in, Eric? We can discuss some new ideas I've had. The office had become a staging ground for Maynard's latest trial of Eric's abilities. Eric would find his spot at the end of the couch, and Benjamin would start into the scientific explanation and justification for his latest elaborate scheme. Thus far as endurance, strength, sight, hearing, blood, and urine had been scrutinized by the doctor's unquenchable thirst for data. Whenever they would approach a discussion of Eric's life or past or troubles, Maynard would now manage to alter the topic into something regarding abilities or anomalies. Eric had earned praise from Dr. Maynard regarding his patients, but little in the way of conventional therapy. In addition, he had yet to hear even a little about the doctor's findings. Before we discuss today's trials, I want to mention something pretty important we haven't touched on yet. The position was familiar, though the tone wasn't. The large leather wingback chair rose behind him. He was leaned forward, his elbows rested on his knees, his hands cupped and caressed one another. This might seem like a strange request, but it's very important. I don't want you to discuss the testing we're doing with outsiders. To maintain the integrity of these experiments, no one can know they're going on. I don't want you to tell Molly or Todd or anyone else. Even if they have the best intentions, their knowledge can affect experiments like these. It would be for their good as much as for ours. Does that make sense? Eric slowly nodded. So we can keep this between us, right? He nodded again. Maynard rose from his leaning position. Okay. I've got an interesting examination planned for you today. I want you to keep an open mind about what I intend to propose. His voice was that of an anxious adolescent asking for permission granted to something undeserved. His face turned tender and nurturing, the irony of which was lost on Eric. I would like to test your injury threshold. Patient log entry number 32, December 10. Blood work test results are revealing and yet ultimately inconclusive. Eric's blood cells appear to be resistant to cellular breakdown. When bombarded with all forms of negative and positive stimuli, they showed no evidence of damage. This should be indicative of his body's entire cellular structure. His DNA appears normal with the appropriate structure and number of chromosomes. I feel like I'm investigating a case with a smoking gun and not one other clue. Perhaps the nature of his cellular invulnerability occurs at the subatomic level and therefore beyond my level of expertise. I was able to deduce that his body's hemoglobin carries very little, if any, oxygen. He therefore needs to breathe very seldom, if at all. The breathing I've witnessed in our trials may simply be a muscular reaction of the diaphragm from the physical act of running. Somehow his cardiovascular system sustains itself without oxygen. Does it then have an alternative source? Stool sampling indicates the digestive system shares similar characteristics to the circulatory system. Vitamins, nutrients, amino acids, carbohydrates, and saturated fats were all found unprocessed in his waste matter. His body digests food matter without breaking it down, instead mashing it about in his internal fluids. Any food energy is quite possibly spent on the digestive process itself. Monitoring his exhaustion levels in earlier trials, along with the findings just mentioned, lead me to some inescapably unscientific conclusions. Eric doesn't need to eat, sleep, drink, or breathe, and the structure of his body and flesh cannot be broken. Though I've witnessed it and have seen the how, I still don't understand the how. The only anomaly in his resistance to cellular breakdown thus far is his hair growth. In order for hair to grow, which his does at a very slow rate, some cellular breakdown must occur. Somehow his body has created these fronts, growing hair, an initial perspiration, contracting diaphragm. Could these highly evolved fronts indicate a genealogy, an ancestry? Which is more likely? That Eric's abilities exist as a freak biochemical accident, or does he signal the emergence of a higher order of our species? Among the many impacts I must consider as I expose Eric and his secrets to the world is his immeasurable potential effect on medical research. His unique cellular structure and resistance to all forms of virus, bacteria, will provide an encyclopedia of knowledge involving inoculations and immune system treatments. I will soon secure the necessary licensing rights to these and all of Eric's physiological applications. I've planned various tests for this morning that will explore his body's reaction to physical stimulus and injury. I anticipate that these tests will cultivate the level of trust I'm trying to build. It will require a heightened level of trust for the deprivation tests that I have planned. Maynard noted Eric's expression as they started the elevator down to the sub-basement. It was fixed with his normal, moderate level of comfort and confusion. The doctor's eyes stayed locked into his through the reflective sliding door. He watched Eric nervously contemplate how often and for how long he should return his stare. The timid eyes moved from his own to the floor, to the oversized briefcase in his right hand and back. His breath was low and calm as he fidgeted about, experimenting with the most agreeable way to stand. His every pore exuded the insecurity that his politeness told him to exhibit. He now knew Eric well enough to know that these fidgets were part of his carefully crafted social defensive mechanism. By seeming uncomfortable, He put others at ease. Every facet of this young man was a marvel to Benjamin. Can I ask you a question, Eric? Did Dr. Harmon know about your abilities? Yes. How did he test you? He asked me. They reached the sub-basement floor, and Maynard led Eric through the concrete maze of maintenance pathways and numbered doors to a row of storage rooms. I had our office's storage facility renovated for today's little experiment. Eric peeked his head into the small storage room Maynard had stopped before. There was an undulating layer of some kind of foam affixed to the walls and ceiling. It looked like a funhouse room. On the bottom floor in the last hallway of a dank, poorly kept prison. Eric turned back to Maynard with an obvious question in his eyes. Ah, yes, of course, the padding. It's just soundproofing. The foam will also safeguard against any ricochet or injury from impact. Eric suddenly had to know. None of this made sense to him. What kind of injuries do you want to test here? Maynard looked back at him with a brisk shiver that he didn't expect, rolled through the base of his skull and down his bones and into his spine. His eyes crooked as he scanned about the floor around him as his mind reeled about. He couldn't understand why someone he trusted was giving him that feeling. It was like feeling a downpour of cold rain under a sunny blue sky. Maynard sat the large briefcase Eric didn't recognize on the floor, rolled the combination key, and slowly raised the lid open. Eric's eyes opened synchronously as the case and its contents came into his view. Pre-cut black foam outlined a black handgun and its magazine clip. Around it was various modular sections of a high-powered rifle, scope, silencer, shoulder butt, and a long magazine. The black metal glimmered under the single light bulb that lit the room. Eric's eyes opened further as he looked back at his doctor. His eyes were ablaze, staring back at him, while his expression was as repressed as it was when he sat in the office chair across from the office couch. The doctor chuckled politely in response to Eric's feeble, childish tone. Don't worry, Eric. I have no intention to hurt you. His voice, that had a physician's mixture of nurturing warmth and kind of a cold inhumanity. Could you remove your shirt and stand over there, please? He produced a cigarette lighter from his pocket and tested it in his cupped hand. We'll start off slow. Chapter 22. Todd had programmed the ringtones on his cell phone to distinguish between the calls he could ignore and those he couldn't. The basic categories for his incoming calls were office subordinates, office superiors, current girlfriend, mom, and other, any of which could be ignorable on any given day. He groaned from somewhere beneath his pillow and blanket as the subordinate's ringtone chimed away on his bedside table. He couldn't ignore that call this morning. Special Agent Danver speaking. Agent Danver. I didn't wake you, did I, sir? It's Hanson. Of course you woke me, Hanson. It's barely 7 o'clock. I'm sorry, sir. I got an early call from Johnson downtown at the 14th. I think we may have a match on that John Doe kid you were looking for. The one possibly connected with the motel arson. We've got the fingerprints we lifted from that cell phone you found. We think he's the kid. I know the one, Hansen. Where are you? Todd was hard on Agent Hansen for several reasons. Janet Hansen was a promising young police officer who quickly made detective. She was courted soon after by the FBI and was proving to be a very promising agent. On top of being a textbook overachiever, she was staggeringly beautiful. The kind of woman that entranced men involuntarily. Todd recognized this, as he did her talent, and wanted to be sure that, while under his supervision, she learned the craft free of the coddling she was used to by male superiors. The undeniable romantic chemistry between Janet and Todd was almost palpable to all within a 5-meter radius, and Todd did everything he could to discourage the unprofessional attraction. In truth, his crass remarks did little to discourage a playful romantic interest. There was a rousing friction in those heated exchanges. It was easy for Janet Hansen to call in favors from the local police department, a feat harder for some agents. She had admirers at every department and precinct that she had visited. If she needed someone found or shaken down or a needless charge expunged, a charming little phone call was all that was required. It was a resource that Todd often tapped. I'm at 44th and Main. I'll be there in 15 minutes. It was a tenement building like any other of the condemnable structures Agent Todd Danver had seemed to spend his time patrolling, visiting, and examining. He walked up the stained front stoop, longing for the days when he'd investigate white-collar criminals, executive offices, and resorts and estates. Special Agent Danver. That was quite a long 15 minutes. Can it, Hansen? What have you got for me? You remember Detective Johnson? Todd was certain Hansen and Johnson had dated before the territorial glare he got through the detective's slick haircut sunglasses. Of course. Long time, Detective. How are things? They exchanged a handshake that was clearly a contest of will. Johnson's grip was intended to warn Todd or scare him or something. Todd let the man have his moment, waited for the grip to cease. Todd gave him a patronizing wink and looked at Janner in a manner that befit his disappearing patience. What have you got for me? This kid matches the description you gave me. 18 years old, slim build, dark hair, looks to have some troubled street kid lifestyle. Killed execution style. 911 emergency call made by the landlord after suspicious sounds were heard from the apartment. The entire building was like the inside of a garbage bag. It was the result of a group of troubled tenants with a clear indifference and perhaps disdain for their environment. Todd passed the unidentifiable food matter and puddles of old and fresh urine, praying that no families or young children were forced to live in the squalor. The apartment wasn't just dirty or cluttered. It was violently unclean. The state of this apartment was the result of someone trying to do harm to himself and his habitat. Todd thought at that moment that he felt what Eric must have seen in this kid's eyes. The coroner thinks he's been dead for about a day, give or take. Johnson chimed in. The landlord called in after a visitor came, and there was some commotion, followed by nothing at all. He never had visitors. She said she was always used to hearing something, like the stereo. When she heard nothing, she tried the door and decided to call the cops. I guess she's the nosy type. Well, we love the nosy type, don't we? Todd did his feeble best to mask his sarcasm, but it was glazed on too thick. Janet elbowed him in the arm. They moved through the kitchen to the bathroom, piled on the salvaged kitchen table were over a dozen magazines that seemed out of place. Todd stopped and fingered through the pile for a theme among the titles. Found them all to be related to high fashion. Addicted to heroin and high fashion. How much crap can one junkie be into? Todd responded to Johnson's glibness with a sharp glare that retracted the detective like a frightened turtle's head. We couldn't fathom what these fancy fantasy magazines conveyed for the young addict. He assumed they had something to do with a beautiful perfection that's as far out of reach as waking equal to a heroin high. Straightened his latex glove as he quickly fingered through the waist-high pile. On the right, looking for an anomaly in the titles. 10 issues into the stack, he noticed the subscription tabs each had the name and address of a methadone clinic downtown. The rehab clinic was yet another on the unglamorous staples of Todd's work. Todd continued to try his best to ignore the offenses of the masses of garbage and food waste. The fridge door sat ajar, glowing slightly sickly light onto the food adjacent to it on the counter, emitting a foulness that Todd could smell across the room. Some of the leftovers were recent, some petrified. This was not a mess caused by some intruder. This was the young man's lifestyle. They approached the bedroom as Hansen and Johnson took turns outlining the facts for Todd. It was done execution style, 2 bullets to the head, Johnson started. The killer was very methodical. We think he or she was familiar with the victim. There's no sign of forced entry and no evidence of struggle. They both stopped and let Todd approach the bedroom alone. He stood in the doorway silent. He'd seen almost 20 murdered bodies in his career with the FBI, and he could vividly describe every one. It wasn't getting easier. The room was comprised of a tattered mattress in the corner and a couple of cardboard boxes adjacent to it that acted as makeshift furniture. Clothes, food, paraphernalia, and other clutter were strewn across everything. A spray of blood splattered a pattern of red dots under a crusty window. A few photographs from a different part of this kid's life were pinned to the wall near the mattress. Todd hated how the smiles and levity in the images unjustly contrasted the scene around him. The kid's arms and legs shot limply outward. His expression was content and calm. His eyes rested open, staring in the direction of the pinned-up memories. He was wearing only a white t-shirt and a soiled pair of boxer shorts. Not only did this kid know who killed him, but he was expecting the person to visit. He has a pair of jeans over there that he could have easily put on before he answered the door. Someone he was comfortable with. How do you know he didn't put his pants on? How can you be sure the perp didn't take them off? Johnson was waiting for the rebut. Look, I've never known a hitter to take the time to remove a guy's pants. Besides, they're scrunched up the way someone kicks them off while asleep. If you check his hips for fingernail marks, I bet you'll find nothing. The position of his body on the floor showed clearly that he wasn't running or thrown to the ground by the shots. The forward momentum would leave a different angle in relation to the trajectory of the blood spray, as well as the bruises already mentioned. We're looking for someone familiar, a client or an employer with a motive, someone not inclined to take every last grain of smack. This kid was executed by someone he not only knew, but also trusted. Todd's words trailed off as his eyes again were grasped by the innocence of the photos pinned on the wall. Oh man, he thought, certain that this was the kid he was looking for. Only now he really began to fear what was growing behind this. The trio reviewed a few more areas of the apartment, and soon after were back outside. In the kitchen, they found a loaded gun in one of the drawers. They discussed the details of the follow-up, including possible leads, witnesses, and the autopsy. Johnson broke from them soon after to brief the officers on the scene and to disperse the scurrying reporters. Todd looked down into Janet Hanson's sympathetic expression and smiled as he produced his cell phone. You can order the body to be taken out now, if the locals are done with it. I have to get in touch with somebody I want to identify the body at the morgue. I'll meet you there. Part of Todd hoped this wouldn't be the lead they were looking for. Todd wasn't looking forward to the part Eric would have to play in all of this. I want to find out every association this kid had, every drug dealer, every friend and enemy. What's the news on his cell phone? It was activated for only one night and connected to only one number. Unfortunately, the number is an unlisted cellular burner that's almost as impossible to trace without a live signal. The phone itself was paid for in cash and was registered to the deceased. So a dead end. Yes. Well, at least we got fingerprints. Find out if he was in any rehabilitation programs. They tend to have stacks of information. No problem. Oh yeah, what's his name? Michael Finn. Eric patiently waited outside the front of his building, though he didn't know the purpose of his brother's surprise visit. Todd's car soon came to an abrupt halt directly in front of him. There was 5 minutes of silence before Eric thought to ask where they were going. Just as his mouth was poised to speak, Todd broke in. Eric, I have a hard job for you today. Eric's eyebrows wrinkled downward at Todd's unmistakably grave tone. The image of that bedroom in those pictures still clouded his eyes, hidden behind shaded sunglasses. We think we found that kid who bumped into you outside the motel. We found him in his apartment. He was dead, Eric. He was killed. Eric looked down at his hands cupped together on his lap as the words sunk into his head. I need you to identify the body and tell me for sure if it's him. Eric's head turned the opposite way, out at the mid-morning scenery through his passenger window. He tried to grasp what it was being asked of him and how he'd deal with the sight of a murdered face. Can you do this for me, Eric? I think so. The city morgue was the strangest place Eric had ever been. The entire building was lifeless. The air and the light inside seemed to hang still. He could see the contours of the young man's face through the thin white fabric. He knew it was the kid from the street before the doctor revealed his face and shoulders. I think I'd have to agree with your theory, Special Agent. I can't find anything that indicates a struggle. Is that the kid, Eric? Eric looked blankly into the still, dead face. Eric? Yes, it is. Was. This life was taken, and Eric now knew he was somehow involved. This meant that what he saw before him was, in a way, his fault. Responsibility was growing around him that Eric wasn't sure he could bear. What was his name, Todd? Michael Finn. That's a nice name. You did a good thing tonight, Eric. I want you to know that. That motel didn't just burn and that kid didn't just die. We're on to something bigger here. We're going to bring a bad person to justice, eventually. Eric raised his hidden face from the floor. Didn't you say that the motel could have been burned because of me? Couldn't this kid have been killed because of me too? You can't think of it like that. You're going to help fix the things that got us here. If I wasn't around, they wouldn't have happened in the first place, wouldn't they? That kid would be alive if I wasn't around, wouldn't he? It doesn't work like that. Todd did his best to gain eye contact with Eric. I used to listen to you and that doctor of yours when we were kids. I think right now he'd say, you just got to keep doing the right thing until things are right. Todd looked back out the windshield of the car and snickered, deciding to change the mood rather than delve into the subject that was too deep for him to handle. I always wished he was my doctor. Seemed like one of those guys who inspires people. He could see Eric's eyes filling with pleasant memories. It had just started to snow. The December air was heavy. Eric softly closed the car door and walked slowly into his building. Todd's car zoomed off as Eric turned to nod a goodbye. The phone never rang that late. It had never rung past 10 o'clock. The ringer cut through the late-night silence, sending the cat shooting from his spot on the couch to a safer place to slumber. Eric stood by the window, looking out over the street, preparing for a walk. He looked at the phone in disbelief for a moment. Hello? Is this Eric? Yes, it is. I read about you in the paper, didn't I? I guess so. Yes. It says in the paper you can do special things. Is that true? The voice was low like a man's, but breathy and nasal, like he was aroused. Can you do special things? Sort of. What would you do to me? Would you do special things to me? What do you mean? The voice giggled back at him like a mischievous child. I've been watching you. Watching me. I can't wait to meet you. Meet me? We'll be meeting each other soon. When you're ready. A last faint chuckle ran over the wire before the connection clicked to an end. Eric stood in silence and wondered how the cat knew to be scared. Thank you for listening to part 7 of The Hero Business. If you like this story so far and you want more, or you feel compelled to throw your support in this direction, the fastest route is through my website, patrickhughes.ca. There you'll find access to my other projects, links to my books and ebooks on various platforms, and a contact me function if you want to reach out. You can also add your valuable support by liking and subscribing and sharing on whatever platform you're visiting. It really makes a difference. Please add your voice with a quick click if you like what you hear. I do hope you share this. Please don't keep any good fiction a secret. Thanks. Remember, Eric Verrity rocks.